At 4:15 a.m. on a quiet September morning, 911 call shattered the stillness. The caller, Curtis Wyatt, sounded breathless and panicked. He told dispatchers that an unknown man had broken into the apartment where he and Yolanda were asleep. According to Curtis, the intruder launched a violent attack right there in the bedroom. His words tumbled out in fragments, shaken, fearful, disoriented. Within minutes, officers arrived at the scene, a residential complex in uptown Chicago. Curtis was found inside, trembling and bruised, while paramedics rushed to stabilize him. But for Yolanda Holmes, it was already too late. The woman known and loved by many had been taken, and what followed would reveal a betrayal no one saw coming. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. Yolanda Holmes was more than just a name on the sign outside her North Broadway hair salon. At 45 years old, she had cultivated a reputation in her Chicago community that went far beyond styling hair. Though she stood only 5 feet tall, the woman affectionately known as Yogi or Shorty carried herself with a confidence and charisma that demanded attention. She was bold, vibrant, and resilient, the kind of person whose presence could fill a room before she even spoke a word. Yolanda owned and operated Nappy Heads, a salon that had become a pillar of the uptown neighborhood. For more than 15 years, she had built not just a thriving business, but a sanctuary for locals, a space where laughter was common, and people came not only for haircuts, but for comfort, camaraderie, and connection. Her clients weren't just patrons, they were extended family. She offered far more than services. She offered time, a listening ear, and support. On countless occasions, she would throw back-to-school giveaways, buying and distributing school supplies to neighborhood kids, ensuring that even those facing hard times would start the academic year with dignity. Her salon doubled as a venue for pop-up shops and holiday drives. Whatever the community needed, Yolanda made it happen. Those closest to her remember Yolanda as deeply compassionate and intensely loyal. Her uncle, James Newman, often spoke of her unwavering commitment to helping others. She didn't just talk about lifting people up, she acted on it. Ayanna Anderson, a stylist who worked at Nappy Heads, described Yolanda as someone whose warmth radiated through every conversation and gesture. "She made you feel like you mattered," Ayanna once said. She had this way of making everyone feel like they were her people. Behind that strength and success, however, was a life shaped by obstacles. Yolanda was a single mother, a role she embraced with fierce devotion. Her son, Kwame Wilson, was born when she was in her early 20s, and from the start, he became the center of her world. She poured every ounce of herself into raising him, striving to give him the life and stability she had worked so hard to achieve. Whether it was new designer clothes, flashy jewelry, or a sleek Mustang, Yolanda spared no effort in giving Kwame the best. When her son ran into legal issues, she didn't hesitate. She hired an attorney, supported him through the proceedings, and even helped him secure employment. She believed in him unconditionally. Their bond went beyond mother and son. They wore matching tattoos of each other's names, etched into their skin as permanent symbols of their love. To her, he wasn't just a child. He was her greatest achievement and the promise of a future she had worked her whole life to build. Kwame was a familiar face around Nappy Heads. From a young age, he hung out at the salon, playfully dubbed the salon baby by clients who watched him grow up. As he got older, he remained close, often stopping by to see his mother, flash a smile, and greet longtime patrons who had become extended family. Yolanda's dream was to one day pass the salon to him, to give him something lasting, something built from love, sweat, and sacrifice. Yolanda's romantic life, by contrast, was less public and more complicated. Although she rarely spoke about her ex-husband, his past loomed quietly in the background. He was serving a life sentence for a double homicide, a dark history that kept him physically and emotionally distant. Whatever emotions Yolanda had about that chapter of her life, she kept them private, focused instead on moving forward and building a peaceful life for her son and herself. But everything changed on a quiet early morning in the fall of 2012. It was just after 4:15 a.m. on September 2nd when a frantic 911 call jolted dispatchers into action. The caller was Curtis Wyatt, Yolanda's on-again, off-again boyfriend. His voice trembled with panic as he spoke to the emergency operator. He claimed an unknown intruder had broken into Yolanda's apartment while they were both asleep. According to Curtis, the attacker had assaulted them, and Yolanda was not responsive. His words were urgent and disoriented, full of shock and fear. Within minutes, officers from the Chicago Police Department arrived at the Wilson Yard apartment complex, a relatively new high-rise meant to offer affordable housing and a sense of safety in a rapidly developing neighborhood. That morning, though, it became the center of a growing mystery. Curtis was found inside, visibly shaken, with minor injuries, cuts and bruises that paramedics later treated at a nearby hospital. He repeated his story to detectives, claiming he had fought off the attacker and then rushed to Yolanda's side, only to discover she was already gone. Investigators immediately recognized that every second would count. The apartment became a secured crime scene, and the Chicago PD's homicide unit, including seasoned detectives John Corrales and Michelle Wood, took control of the case. The apartment itself offered a haunting silence broken only by the sound of police radios and camera shutters. There were signs of a struggle, but they were largely confined to one area, Yolanda's bedroom. It was here that detectives made the most chilling discovery. Yolanda's body bore the unmistakable signs of what Detective Wood later described as overkill. The injuries inflicted were so severe, so deliberate, that they pointed to an intent far beyond simple harm. This had been personal. On the bedroom floor lay a gun with a broken handle. It appeared to have been used, or at least handled, during the confrontation. Nearby, in a detail that raised immediate red flags, investigators noticed that a paring knife was missing from the kitchen's knife block. That knife was later found next to Yolanda. The fact that it had been taken from inside the apartment suggested something chilling. The weapon wasn't brought in. It was found on site. That detail hinted at either premeditation or familiarity, perhaps even both. Then came a discovery that puzzled even the most experienced officers. Among the debris in the bedroom, tangled in bed linens and fragments of broken furniture, was a damaged headphone cord or earpiece. It seemed out of place. Was it something the attacker dropped? A struggle item? Or was it simply a red herring? All of the evidence, knife, firearm, headphone wire, was collected with meticulous care and rushed to the forensics lab for DNA, fingerprint, and trace analysis. While evidence technicians did their work, detectives turned their attention back to the only known witness and survivor, Curtis Wyatt. Curtis, still reeling from the attack, answered questions from his hospital bed. His account was consistent with what he had told officers at the scene. He claimed that he and Yolanda were sleeping when they were awakened by an unknown man entering the bedroom. According to Curtis, the attacker opened fire first and then launched an attack. He said he fought back, managing to force the man out of the apartment. By the time he returned to the bedroom, Yolanda was unresponsive. But there was one critical issue detectives couldn't ignore. The apartment door showed no signs of forced entry. No broken locks, no splintered frame, no signs of prying. It looked as though the intruder had simply walked in. That troubling fact led detectives to question whether the killer had been let in by someone Yolanda knew, or whether they had their own way in. As investigators peeled back the layers of Yolanda Holmes' life and death, one question loomed over them like a shadow. Who would want to harm a woman so deeply loved? From the very beginning, Curtis Wyatt's account of what happened that early September morning had raised some eyebrows. While his story sounded plausible on the surface, there were troubling inconsistencies, small details that didn't quite fit together. To the detectives assigned to the case, particularly seasoned investigators John Corrales and Michelle Wood, experience had taught them to pay attention to those gaps. In high-stakes investigations, it's often what's missing that matters most. Once Curtis was discharged from the hospital and deemed physically stable, authorities brought him in for a formal, recorded interview. This wasn't just routine procedure. It was an opportunity to examine his story under pressure. The interrogation was deliberate and focused. Detectives took turns walking through the timeline, probing inconsistencies, and testing Curtis's recollection of key moments. Curtis, for his part, stuck to his narrative. He claimed that he had been asleep next to Yolanda when a stranger entered the apartment. According to him, the attacker had fired a weapon and then fled. Curtis said he had chased the man out and then called 911 after discovering that Yolanda was unresponsive. But something in his tone gave the detectives pause. His body language suggested anxiety beyond what trauma might explain. Of course, being a witness or survivor in such a case could easily rattle anyone. But law enforcement officers are trained to distinguish between fear and avoidance. Curtis wasn't combative or evasive, but there was a flatness to his effect that seemed off. In order to move closer to the truth, detectives offered Curtis a polygraph test, a lie detector. While polygraphs aren't admissible in court as definitive proof, they are commonly used during investigations to assess whether a person's statements align with their physiological responses. Curtis agreed to the test, perhaps confident that it would help clear his name or at least remove some suspicion. The results were not what anyone had hoped for. According to the examiner, Curtis's responses to key questions suggested deception. While this didn't confirm guilt or innocence, it introduced a new layer of doubt. Now, investigators had a man whose story couldn't be disproved outright, but whose truthfulness had come under question in a measurable way. Detectives intensified their efforts, hoping to uncover evidence that might clarify Curtis's role. Despite the results of the polygraph, they had no physical proof that tied him directly to the act itself. He remained a central figure in the investigation, not officially charged, but no longer viewed as a passive bystander either. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the crime scene was ongoing. Every object, every smudge, every trace of DNA was under scrutiny. One item stood out: the broken headphone cord or earpiece discovered in the bedroom. It seemed almost too specific, too personal to be dismissed as a random object. Technicians carefully examined it for traces of DNA, hopeful that it would connect to someone. The lab succeeded in extracting a viable DNA profile. The sample was then compared against those of Yolanda and Curtis and scanned through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, which contains profiles of individuals from across the country with criminal records or prior arrests. The result was frustrating. The DNA didn't belong to Yolanda or Curtis, and it wasn't in the database at all. This confirmed that a third party had almost certainly been present in the apartment that night, strengthening the theory of another individual being involved. But without a match, the lead hit a wall. This discovery created a complicated dynamic. On one hand, it supported Curtis's claim that another person had been there. On the other, the lack of forced entry pointed investigators back toward Curtis again. If there really was a third person, how had they entered the secured building without triggering any alarm or disturbing the apartment door? Did Curtis know the intruder? Could he have let them in willingly or unknowingly? To answer these questions, detectives reviewed surveillance footage from the Wilson Yard apartment complex once again. Though the footage was grainy and low resolution, it did capture a significant event. Around 4:32 a.m., just minutes before the emergency call, a man was seen entering the building. He wore a hoodie, carried clothing on a hanger, and held a large detergent bottle. The combination was strange, especially for that hour. More telling was the fact that he entered using a code, suggesting that he either had access or had been given the code by someone who did. By 4:46 a.m., the man exited the building. This 14-minute window was chillingly close to Curtis's 911 call, which had been placed at 4:15 a.m. Although the man's face was not clearly visible, his attire and the headphones he wore echoed Curtis's earlier statements. The broken earpiece recovered from the scene appeared to connect directly to this mysterious figure. Unfortunately, no one in the building could identify him. He had passed by a resident while leaving, but that person was unrelated to the case and had not interacted with him. Detectives were left with a compelling timeline and a visual clue, but no confirmed identity. The absence of a DNA match, combined with Curtis's questionable polygraph and the lack of direct evidence, left the case suspended in uncertainty. It was as though the investigators had nearly completed a jigsaw puzzle, only to discover the final pieces had been taken away. Detectives expanded their efforts. They canvassed the building again, knocking on doors, re-interviewing neighbors, and reviewing logs of past visitors. They examined Yolanda's financial transactions, her recent spending habits, and her text messages, hoping something might indicate a brewing conflict or a hidden connection to the intruder. One breakthrough came not from new evidence, but from Yolanda's phone records. Detectives discovered that Yolanda had not one but two phones under her name. This discovery changed the landscape of the investigation. One phone, used for both personal and business communication, was already in police custody. But the second device opened up new questions. Why did she need another line? Who had she been contacting from that number? The second phone's call logs revealed a different web of interactions. While her main device showed familiar names, family, clients, and Curtis, this other phone included contacts investigators hadn't previously identified. Detectives began the painstaking process of mapping out the calls and texts, focusing on activity from the days immediately leading up to September 2nd. This new thread of inquiry held promise. If someone had been communicating with Yolanda via this alternate number, it might explain how an individual had access to her building's entry code. It might also illuminate a side of Yolanda's life that even her closest friends and family didn't fully know. The second phone, however, told a different story. Unlike her primary device, which reflected the life of a salon owner, community pillar, and loving mother, the activity on this other phone suggested a life far more complex. It was a digital trail that whispered secrets, not of Yolanda's own doing, but of those closest to her. This second line had been active in Chicago's uptown neighborhood, operating on a separate pattern of communication that didn't overlap with Yolanda's usual contacts. One particular number stood out, repeating in call logs, both in the hours leading up to the tragedy and in the days that followed. That single detail raised investigators' suspicions. Further examination revealed that the phone had been used to send text messages as well. The texts weren't explicit, but they were troubling. Short, coded exchanges that hinted at planning. One message, sent just hours before Yolanda's death, referred to handling business. It was vague, yes, but in the context of an unsolved crime, it suggested coordination, a plan in motion. Detectives needed to know who was behind these communications. With the trail warming up, they turned their attention back to Yolanda's family and friends. They began re-interviewing people in her inner circle, this time with sharper questions. One query led to a significant realization. Yolanda was known for her generosity, always offering help, gifts, and support, even when it came to phones. Had she given this second line to someone else? Her son, Kwame Wilson, better known to friends as Kwame, came into sharper focus. Kwame had already been vocal during the investigation, particularly in his early conversations with Detective Michelle Wood. He had pointed fingers at Curtis Wyatt, Yolanda's boyfriend, implying that Wyatt had both motive and opportunity. But as the investigators pulled phone location data and compared it against known movements, a different picture began to emerge, one that placed Kwame closer to the situation than anyone had expected. The second phone's usage pattern aligned with Kwame's locations, and the number it had most frequently dialed belonged to a name previously unknown in the case: Eugene Spencer. A 22-year-old man from Chicago's South Side, Spencer was a known associate of Kwame. Until that moment, his name had never surfaced in connection to Yolanda's life. Detectives didn't make assumptions. They followed procedure, cross-referencing financial records and digital communications to establish patterns. What they found was concerning. Yolanda's bank accounts had been accessed after her passing. Large withdrawals were made in a short span of time, behavior that immediately raised red flags. Simultaneously, the second phone remained active. New location pings traced it to the North Austin neighborhood, many miles from Yolanda's home in Uptown. Investigators began mapping the movements of the device, comparing them to Kwame's known whereabouts, gradually building a behavioral profile. It pointed to someone who was on the move, cautious but not careful enough to go unnoticed. Digging deeper into Eugene Spencer's activity, detectives discovered he'd been calling another number regularly around the time of the incident. That number led to Lorana Johnson, a 23-year-old woman living on East 131st Place on Chicago's far south side. She, too, was part of Kwame's past. His ex-girlfriend, with a personal history that, until now, had been irrelevant to the case. Phone records didn't just link Kwame, Spencer, and Johnson. They tangled them together in a dense web of calls and texts that surged in volume just before Yolanda was killed. Spencer's phone even showed that it had pinged a cellular tower near the Wilson Yard complex at precisely the time the surveillance footage showed a hooded figure entering the building. The alignment between digital records and physical evidence became impossible to ignore. By the end of 2013, the case had shifted from mystery to motive. What had once been a cold investigation marked by frustrating dead ends now burned with focused determination. The second phone, originally registered in Yolanda's name, had, in reality, been a gift from a loving mother to her son. She wanted him to have access, stability, and connection. What she couldn't have known was that the very device meant to support him would instead betray her. On December 22, 2013, police made their move. Kwame Wilson, then 24 years old, was arrested at his apartment in North Austin. Less than 24 hours later, detectives apprehended Eugene Spencer from Chicago's South Side, followed closely by Lorana Johnson. Each suspect was taken into custody without incident. The charges were serious. Kwame was booked for murder and home invasion. Spencer was charged with first-degree murder, home invasion, and aggravated discharge of a firearm. Johnson faced charges of murder and home invasion as an accomplice. During the bond hearing at Cook County Criminal Court, Judge Adam Bourgeois Jr. denied bail. He described the crime as a cold and calculated betrayal of a woman who dedicated her life to those she loved. The community in Uptown, still grappling with Yolanda's death, was stunned. Her salon, Nappy Heads, remained open in her memory, a living monument to her years of hard work and compassion. But behind the warmth of candles and flowers on the sidewalk, neighbors and friends were left to wrestle with a chilling question. How could her own son have been involved? In the weeks that followed, a fuller picture began to emerge. Kwame, it turned out, had been pursuing a music career, performing at local venues and sharing music online. He had aspirations of breaking into the rap scene, chasing a dream that many young artists in Chicago shared. But while his ambition burned bright, his career never quite took off. His mother's success far outpaced his, and with Yolanda's resources within reach, temptation may have taken root. Investigators learned that within just a week of Yolanda's passing, Kwame had started accessing her finances. As the designated beneficiary of her estate, which included approximately $90,000 in savings and 2 life insurance policies, he quickly began withdrawing substantial amounts of money. The withdrawals were tracked and documented, and their timing coincided with the planning and aftermath of the incident. In one particularly disturbing piece of evidence, a video surfaced online weeks later, one that would cast a shadow over Kwame's defense. In the video, he was seen standing in a parking lot, throwing wads of cash into the air as a crowd of people scrambled to collect it. The footage, uploaded to YouTube, showed a young man celebrating wealth at a time when his family was still in mourning. Prosecutors eventually revealed the most damning detail. Kwame had offered Eugene Spencer $3,500 to carry out the act. Spencer would later claim he received only a fraction of that amount, $70 in total. Nevertheless, Spencer's role was active, not peripheral. He had entered Yolanda's home that morning, disguised and prepared. As for Lorana Johnson, her involvement was logistical but essential. She had driven Spencer to Yolanda's apartment complex on the morning of September 2, 2012, waited while he entered the building, and then drove him away afterward. Johnson later claimed she believed the incident was only meant to be a robbery, not something more serious. Her family publicly supported this version of events, emphasizing that she had been manipulated and misled. When detectives interrogated the suspects in late December 2013, the conversations were intense and emotional. Kwame, questioned again by Detective Wood, initially denied direct involvement. He deflected, minimized, and tried to steer blame elsewhere. But as the facts mounted and the evidence spoke louder than words, his story began to collapse under its own weight. Under the weight of evidence and hours of persistent questioning, Kwame Wilson eventually admitted to his role in what he insisted was a planned robbery gone wrong. He told investigators that his original intention had never been to cause his mother's death, but rather to secure quick money to fund his music career. According to him, the idea had been simple, at least in his mind: stage a burglary, take the cash, and disappear. But as he explained it, something went horribly off course. When detectives asked about the second phone, the one tied to cryptic messages and suspicious calls, Kwame confirmed it had been his. He revealed that it had been a gift from Yolanda, an act of maternal generosity meant to help him stay connected and on track. That very gift would later serve as a digital fingerprint, linking him to the devastating plan he now struggled to explain. Further investigation uncovered that Kwame had not only supplied Eugene Spencer with a firearm, but he had also handed over specific clothing items and a bottle of detergent. These seemingly mundane objects had been part of a calculated effort to create the illusion that Spencer belonged in the Wilson Yard apartment complex, that he lived there. It was a crude but clever disguise, one that ultimately unraveled. The interrogation of Eugene Spencer proved to be a major breakthrough in the case. Initially, Spencer claimed he had been set up. He denied involvement and appeared agitated, even combative. But after hours of detailed questioning, during which detectives presented evidence from surveillance footage, phone logs, and forensic reports, his defenses collapsed. He finally admitted to entering Yolanda's apartment on the morning of September 2, 2012. His confession aligned with much of what detectives had pieced together, confirming that he had been the hooded figure caught on security cameras. His story, however, downplayed his intent. Like Kwame, Spencer claimed the goal was only to take money, not to harm anyone. But investigators saw this narrative for what it likely was, an attempt to distance himself from the full weight of responsibility. Lorana Johnson's role in the conspiracy was less clear-cut. Throughout her questioning, she maintained that she believed she was simply helping a friend commit a robbery. According to her, she had no knowledge that the plan involved violence or that it would end in a loss of life. Her attorney emphasized her limited involvement, underscoring that she had not entered the apartment, nor had she wielded a weapon. Despite her partial cooperation, Johnson's actions helped prosecutors reconstruct the events of that fateful morning. Phone records showed that she had communicated extensively with both Kwame and Spencer during the hours surrounding the crime. She had driven Spencer to the complex and picked him up afterward. Whether or not she understood the true nature of the crime, her participation was undeniable. As prosecutors would later argue in court, the motive behind the plot was tragically straightforward: greed. Kwame Wilson, desperate to accelerate his music career, saw his mother's financial assets as an opportunity. The $90,000 she had in savings, along with 2 life insurance policies and ownership of her profitable salon, Nappy Heads, became targets. Rather than building his own legacy, he chose to exploit hers. The arrests of Kwame, Spencer, and Johnson in December 2013 sent shockwaves through Chicago's uptown community. For Yolanda's family, the news was both clarifying and deeply painful. Justice was finally within reach, but the personal betrayal was difficult to bear. By the beginning of 2015, Lorana Johnson's legal path had diverged from the others. Faced with mounting evidence and encouraged by her legal counsel, she entered a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of armed robbery, acknowledging that she had knowingly assisted in the crime, albeit under a false understanding of its severity. On February 27, 2015, she was sentenced to 14 years in prison, with credit for the time she had already served since her arrest. Meanwhile, the legal journey for Kwame and Spencer proved far more complicated. Both men were held without bail, and their trials were delayed repeatedly due to the complexity of the case, the volume of digital evidence, and the need to ensure procedural fairness. By March 2019, nearly 7 years after Yolanda's death, the long-awaited trial commenced at the George Layton Criminal Courthouse in Chicago. The courtroom was solemn but packed, filled with members of Yolanda's extended family, friends, and community supporters. Her sister, Yolanda Holmes, and her aunt, Sandra Jackson, attended each day, seated just behind the prosecution table. The trial lasted 1 emotional week. The courtroom heard testimony and reviewed evidence that painted a picture of betrayal layered with manipulation and opportunity. Prosecutors, led by Assistant State's Attorney Maura White, presented a meticulous case grounded in forensic data, surveillance footage, banking transactions, and detailed phone records. Though Johnson had accepted a plea deal years earlier, her statements were referenced in court to support the prosecution's timeline and argument. She was not called as a witness, but her prior cooperation was used to validate key elements of the conspiracy. Kwame Wilson's defense attorney, Stephen Richards, pursued a strategy built on discrediting his client's confession. Richards argued that the confession had been coerced, made under emotional distress, and that detectives had influenced his account by feeding him details. Quame's repeated claim that it was supposed to be a robbery became a centerpiece of the defense. His legal team emphasized that he had no prior history of violence and that his actions were misguided, not malicious. They also tried to discredit Eugene Spencer's version of events, highlighting inconsistencies in his statements and suggesting that Spencer may have acted independently. The defense cast doubt on the intent to kill and attempted to reinterpret the damning phone logs, arguing that frequent communication did not equal conspiracy. Spencer's defense took a distinctly different approach. His attorney, Michael McHale, redirected suspicion toward Curtis Wyatt, Yolanda's boyfriend, who had been present during the incident. McHale pointed out Wyatt's failed polygraph test in 2012 and suggested he had more to hide than investigators believed. The argument painted Spencer as a reluctant participant, manipulated by Quame, pressured into acting, and unaware of the full plan. But the juries weren't swayed. On March 5, 2019, the jury assigned to Quame deliberated for just over 2 hours before delivering its verdict: guilty on all counts. He was convicted of first-degree murder, attempted murder of Curtis Wyatt, and home invasion. The following day, March 6th, the jury for Eugene Spencer reached its decision after nearly 12 hours of deliberation spread across 2 days. They too found him guilty on all charges. The verdicts were a resounding victory for the prosecution. Yolanda's family, seated in the courtroom's front row, cried softly as the decisions were read aloud. Their pain, still fresh after years of waiting, was finally met with justice. Sentencing took place on January 31, 2020. Judge Stanley Sachs addressed both defendants with a somber tone, describing the crime as unforgivable in its cruelty and a calculated, devastating betrayal of trust. Quamaine Wilson received a sentence of 99 years, 45 years for the murder of Yolanda Holmes, 25 years for the attempted murder of Curtis Wyatt, and 29 years for the home invasion, each sentence to be served consecutively. Eugene Spencer received a 100-year sentence, 45 years for murder, 25 for attempted murder, and 30 for home invasion. According to Illinois Department of Corrections records, Spencer will not be eligible for parole until March 22, 2080, a date that might as well be a lifetime away.